Hello, and welcome back to Catalyzing Coherence. We are happy to have you here today. We have Jeremy Lent here with us today, who is an amazing individual and author of The Patterning Instinct, which is a fascinating tour de force through the history of the development of culture and philosophy and how that shapes our mind. This was brought to my attention. I can't believe I didn't know about it, but Brian came to me a couple weeks ago and said, "Hey Matt, there's this book and this author, and he knows, it's everything. It's everything we're talking about. It's everything we're trying to figure out. We need to have him on the show, and you're here today." And I thought it might be nice for Brian to talk a little bit about what moved him so much and what he saw in that book, and that can kind of transition into this conversation.
Sure. Yeah. So thanks, Jeremy and Matthew. And so, yeah, your tagline for the book, a cultural history of humanity's search for meaning. Mm-hmm. When I was describing your book to folks, I say it's a combination of Yuval Harari's *Sapiens* meets sort of Bertrand Russell's *History of Western Philosophy*, in that it's telling the largest tale imaginable about our species and the nature of the world we live in, and putting it together in a coherent story. And coherence is obviously something that we are super interested in and believe is imperative to catalyze. But your book, you even mentioned, you're creating here a coherent cosmological system that, or attempting to at least to put all of these different worldviews into the same space of understanding, so that we can try to recognize evolution contextually and how it's adapted to different cultures, and how all of these things have bubbled forth into the present reality of our technological age. And so this goes deep into the roots of sort of East and West, trying to understand the nature of duality and oneness. I think the ways you articulate Taoism and then Confucianism is so important for people to understand, because they're probably the most approximate frameworks of the world that we have, in my humble opinion. I've just found, as someone that's an idea seeker, they're just great ideas to grip, really bite into. So we're definitely going to talk about that today. I'm trying to think where we might want to kick this off. Is there anything that, this is a relatively new book for you. What was the inspiration for writing it? I know your background, you've done some other things as well. How did you come to even start thinking about the Patterning Instinct?
Yeah, well, sure. Yeah, well, as you said, the subtitle is A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning. And for me, really, the book emerged out of my own personal search for meaning. Because as you kind of alluded to, the first part of my life, I was actually doing very different stuff. I actually was a founder of an internet company during that first internet phase, and actually took it public and was really living a very different life. And then a lot of the things I'd built kind of crashed around me. My wife at the time, she passed away some years back. She became very sick. I left the company to look after her. The company then basically collapsed within a year or two. And it felt like the things I'd built my life around were kind of crashing. And even my wife that I looked after for a number of years then was in cognitive decline, so I kind of lost her, really, even while she was still alive. And I went through this phase of realizing I could build my life going forward in a place that was truly meaningful. But what was that? So I started my own search. So it really came out of my own personal desire to understand, not just take what was given as these received ideas of what meaning is, but really understand for myself, what is really a meaningful life? And what do other cultures say about that? And then as I started to sort of peel the onion, if you will, I got more and more into looking at sciences, because whatever I did with my life going forward, I wanted it to be truly rigorous intellectually, as well as feeling that it was deeply meaningful spiritually. So I got kind of stuck in a lot of reductionist science ideas of, when we really look at our life as really meaningless. But in my heart, I didn't feel that was right. but then kept looking and then kept starting to find some of what I see as some of the answers in traditional indigenous and then traditional Chinese thought, and started to discover systems and complexity science too. And these things began to cohere in a way for me.
It's so funny because, I mean, my search is just similar in that I was searching for meaning in my own life, and I, go down this rabbit hole of ideas, and it's funny that we all come out, not all, but a lot of people come out and we're like, oh yeah, like this is really important. Like complexity science is really important. Taoism is really important. The Upanishads is a great read. Everyone should read the Bhagavad Gita, like understand like Brahman and Atman and all these things. They're like really cool ideas. And I'm so excited. Like what Matthew and I are trying to do here is to help seed these ideas into the zeitgeist. And with your book, you've so beautifully wrapped it into this experience of like, okay, here they are. This is it, guys.
I think one of the core thematics in the book that might help us kind of start with the broader brushstrokes and perhaps go from there is this notion of culture shaping values and then value shaping history. This notion that there is this reciprocity between the course of history, the course of action, and the culture in which we're embedded, and that when separate cultures have their own perhaps evolutionary paths, their own distinct behaviors or rituals or customs, that shapes literally the universe of action and choice in a way that can be invisible. So maybe talk a little bit about that, and like especially maybe the dichotomy as you see it between East and West, or the different paths they took.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. That's a great place to sort of start to dig in. And as you know, the book begins with what I see as one of these iconic stories of around that whole issue of how culture shapes history, because actually a lot of modern historians say the opposite, like the kind of the mainstream current approach to history. The people like Jared Diamond got set in place, and he wrote some great work and did a great job of pulling history away from this kind of cultural essentialism that it was stuck in for basically centuries in the Western mind, which is this idea that somehow there was something better about the European worldview, which made Europe and America more successful and all this stuff. So he kind of took this away and looked at history at this what it was known as geographic determinism. Actually, people are the same everywhere, but the geography leads to different ways in which people evolve. So that idea is a powerful one, a step forward. But then people got really stuck in this notion of thinking that human beings are the same everywhere, and that the only thing that shapes history is how the geography works.
Right.
But what they're really doing, actually, that's another form of cultural imperialism. They're applying modern Western values and beliefs about human nature and saying that's what people are all across the board, not realizing that they're stuck in their own frame. So this kind of story I'm looking at it goes back into the 15th century, and we all know that in 1492 Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue and discovered the new world.
The meme is deeply embedded.
Yeah, exactly. And we go, okay, well that's how the modern world began, and imperialism, etc. But so what very few people know is that earlier in that same century, in the early 1400s, there was this Chinese Admiral Zheng, who basically commanded an armada of about 300 massive ships, so big that you could have fit 10 of Columbus's boats into one of Zheng's boats. This huge armada, something like 27,000 people in this armada. He sailed the Indian Ocean for about 30 years, basically owned the place. He could go to East Africa, Arabia, Sri Lanka, and he was treated like a god in some places because they had so much power. But he didn't choose to do what Columbus did when when Columbus landed in the West Indies, he looked at how the indigenous people seemed so naive and so vulnerable. They didn't even know what a sword was. And he wrote back to the King and Queen of Spain, with just a few people, we could take control of them all and bring them all back as slaves to Spain. He was instantly focused on this notion of exploitation, of using power to disrupt whatever they saw and just basically exploit the people and the land. But Zheng had a very different worldview. His view was the sense of harmonious equilibrium. So he definitely thought that China was like the numero uno, and so he'd want to bring like ambassadors. He'd find the prince of whatever area, bring them back to China to kowtow to the emperor, recognize how great China was. But it wasn't about exploiting. He could have, if he'd wanted to, enslaved entire populations, mined the wealth, but he didn't choose to. In fact, when there was piracy, he would take his forces and get control of the pirates. So his notion was that the reason for having power was to maintain harmony, to keep things in a place of equilibrium for human flourishing, rather than exploit. But of course, no, none of us have ever heard of Admiral Zheng, and everyone knows of Columbus. So somehow, that Western approach of exploitation became, because of the success in how it basically dominated the world, has become what we think as the de facto approach to the world, which is really unique to a particular culture.
Do you think that's perhaps because, I mean, it seems as if what you're saying, and please correct me if this is an incorrect characterization, is that there might still have been some element of imperialism there, but it might have been it's an integrative imperialism to some extent, or like a more harmonious meshing of that contact surface area between someone exploring or moving into new territory and those who existed before. And that might be more nuanced and balanced, but it's also perhaps slower and more delicate. And the Western cultural imperative was more move forward as quickly and forcefully as possible to invade the space and completely replace what is there. And therefore, like, maybe it outcompetes the other in the short term, but causes a lot of harm in the long term.
Yeah, I think you're really right on in what you're saying. And something that comes out of what you're saying, it's really important to emphasize. And I try to touch on this a few times in the book, but sometimes when I get so excited talking about some of these other cultures, it gets misinterpreted, is there's no golden age in some past. And no matter, as I'm looking at that contrast, somebody could hear me sort of imply that what I'm saying is Zheng's approach was the right one and Columbus's was the wrong one. But, China at that time was imperialist, hugely hierarchical, hugely patriarchal. One of the most just hugely unequal, just like so many, in fact, virtually every agrarian civilization in history. So we don't want to sort of view that as some sort of, they had the answer and we got to get back to that answer. More than anything, I think, is that we can look at these different cultural frames for clues, for this recognition that very few people have in today's world, that there are other worldviews, there are other ways of making sense of the world than the one that is pounded into our brains from when we're just infants and we just see all around us. I think that's, if there's just one message people take away from reading my book, I'd be satisfied if that was just the message, the recognition there are other ways of making sense of things. But also, one step beyond that is also recognizing that other cultures may have deep, profound insights into the nature of reality and the nature of the human relationship with the universe that we can actually use, accommodate, incorporate into a modern worldview, not to go back in time, not to believe in some golden age, but to recognize areas of value that maybe we can cohere, to use your word, into a worldview that could actually allow us to fix some of these imbalances that our modern worldview has. I think that what we need to understand about the modern worldview is hugely powerful. It was the modern, that sort of underlying that worldview of Columbus's was the same kind of thinking that led to the scientific revolution. This notion that if we can understand things, we can get power over them, and then we can do all these amazing things. We can change the realities that have gone before. Amazing, powerful ideas, but that's led, because of the way it's evolved in those, especially the last century or two, it's led to these huge imbalances between the direction of human civilization and the natural world, to the point that our very civilization itself is at stake. And certainly the natural world is suffering hugely as a result of what we're doing.
Yeah, the culture has shifted, or it's been influenced by this notion of man versus nature. that stems from this duality that goes back to ancient times, to the philosophies that seeded the world that we still live in today.
That's right.
Yeah, is there any, with respect to, ancient Greece, Plato's mentioned a lot in this book, so is the ancient Vedic texts and the sort of mystical interpretations of Atman and Brahman. How do you view those sort of dualistic frameworks with respect to the evolution of life on this planet?
Yeah, that was one of the things that I discovered as I did the research for this, is going back in time, realizing that there was really a new way of looking at the world and in this kind of dualistic form that arose. Really, the seeds of it were back with the Proto-Indo-Europeans, these kind of horsemen in the steppes, like thousands of years ago. People, most of us haven't even heard of them. And even the archaeologists, they're like putative. We don't actually know exactly where they live. That's why they're called the Proto-Indo-Europeans. But we know for sure, just based on etymology, looking at languages, where they come from, that there was this group of horsemen in the steppes some thousand years before, and their culture went into India with the Aryans. It also went into Iran and became Zoroastrianism, and it went into Greece and led to the thinking of the ancient Greeks. So, and in all these different areas, it was fundamentally dualistic. And what we mean when I say dualistic in that respect is, up until that time in history, all the different worldviews that early agrarian civilizations or hunter-gatherers or indigenous people had around the world was the sense of everything being connected in one way or another. And they all had this sense that humans had spirits. When you died, there was still a spirit around. But the spirit itself was kind of semi-material. It wasn't like this abstract entity. It was, and it was kind of connected with natural things, and all of nature had spirits. And even if they had some sense of a high God up there in the heavens, it was sort of part of a deep connection with everything else around. There was some sort of materiality to it all. But what the ancient Greeks did was come up with this notion of a split cosmos, where they said there's actually two dimensions. There's this eternal dimension, which is just almost like an abstraction, and everything is perfection in that dimension, and unchanging and eternal. And then there's the worldly dimension, the material stuff that is polluted. And there was this clear sense of good and bad. That eternal dimension was good, and this stuff down here
the
was
seed
bad.
of like the idea of like fallenness.
Yeah, exactly. That's and so that Christianity, in a sense, was the sort of a dualistic systematic cosmology coming from that early Greek idea. And along with this world, this universe being split, they saw humans as being split, a soul and a body. And they saw reason as being this part of humanity that connected us with divinity. So they saw the split. So emotion became this bad thing that sort of took you away from being in touch with eternal divinity. And so they saw the soul and this kind of separation from the body as being the fundamental essence of a split human being. And that, I think, was what I began to realize. That was one of the sort of underlying foundations of thought that we still inherit to this day. So Christianity took those ideas and created this idea of a God and this kind of world below. And essentially, if your soul could make sure you led a good life, you'd end up in heaven, your soul would end up in heaven. Or if you actually gave way to your passions, you'd end up in hell. So this very, very split dualistic thought. But also when you begin to realize that, when you begin to think of the human as being really that soul, then you begin to look at the rest of the world as being kind of desacralized. Because if what makes humans divine is the fact that we have a soul, do other animals have a soul? Well, no. If you connect the soul with reason, you say, well, other animals, they don't have language, they don't have reason. They're not really, they don't have the same level of divinity that we have.
You like sever the entire emergent pathway that led to the creation of reason itself.
Exactly.
The emergence of reason.
Right. And what's so fascinating is that Descartes came along, and he sort of almost took these ancient Christian and Greek ideas of soul and stuff, and he translated it into more modern language of mind. And so and he was the one who really, he took soul and kind of said, actually, soul is mind. And so his great thing is, I think, therefore I am, right. Which basically he sort of defined his very human essence as being his ability to think, his reason.
And also not the opposite, which is I am, therefore I think, which might be also quite appropriate if you're thinking about it reciprocally.
That's right. Or in fact, the very notion of I is this kind of split that we come to. So there's one interesting book looking at language in, say, East Asian languages versus Western type of languages. And you couldn't say, I think, therefore I am, in an East Asian language. Right. You'd say something a little more like, thinking, therefore being. Yeah. And there's a whole different reality. It's like this kind of process. It would lead to a completely different direction of thought.
Right. Yeah. This notion of process is very important, right? So on the East, you have the Book of Changes, which is the paradigm there is heaven and earth, and it has this rhythm, this yin and yang, harmonious dance of change. And so that is what seeded that sort of whole philosophy, which is in distinction to what we just talked about.
Yes, and so that's really sort of one of the core themes of the book. It's almost like you can look at these two different pathways. So you see this amazing new form of dualistic thinking beginning with the ancient Greeks, and then in China, you see a very different pathway where they took some of the earliest indigenous and hunter-gatherer ways of looking at the world as being everything being interconnected. But they developed a very sophisticated and thoughtful cosmology based on that, which, as you say, like this looks at this notion of the I Ching as the Book of Changes, and their underlying metaphor, if you will, of the universe was what I called like a harmonious web of life. And you can think, like, imagine you're walking in a forest somewhere and you see a spider's web, and you know that just a little leaf falling and touching that spider's web causes reverberations of that web all through it, or just a drop of water will do the same. And so if you look at the whole universe as being this web that we're on, then you instantly begin to realize that in the smallest actions that each of us take has reverberations, some of which we may not even be aware of.
Even more so than now that we're completely networked as tightly as we are with all of our technology.
Exactly. That just makes it even more the case. And so, and it leads to almost like a sense of humility in how you approach the world, because if you're living in a web of life, you don't want to disrupt it. You don't want to exploit it to the point that, because everything could like come apart at the seams.
Would you say that? So this is reminding me pretty strongly. Someone we talk a lot about is Terence McKenna. In many respects, like he threw out a lot of ideas, and many of those were, I think, quite deep and profound in some of their insights that have been unpacked later. One of the talks when he spoke of the I Ching or the I Ching, he was speaking of this notion of the West having been effectively focused on mastering matter and energy and the control of like that essential nature of what is seemingly fixed, and boiling it down to its most essential parts, its most like the smallest component atoms, atomos, right?
Yes.
Whereas the East was far more focused on the notion of time or flows or process or unfolding. And they focused very much on mastering this idea of process dynamics over time, and created very specialized tools for thinking of those types of structures. So like, is that a fair characterization as well? Like this idea of like essentialism in the West and like dynamism in the East? Is that a decent way of thinking of it?
I think that distinction is really key. And I mean, the way that I look at it is more in terms of, sort of as Terence McKenna said, like you've got sort of stuff and you've got the ways in which stuff relates to other stuff. And one of the things that got me most excited as I sort of did the research for this book is, at the same time I was reading the history, I was looking at modern scientific insights. And as you're very familiar with, there's these kind of new sciences of connectivity, if you will. And you see that in systems thinking, see that in complexity theory, see that in systems biology, chaos theory, all of these different and really rigorous sciences of connectivity look not so much at the stuff, but the connections between things, like network theory, looking at how things relate to each other as being what is sometimes, if not either as important or even more important than what the stuff itself is made out of. Looking for universal principles, so that you see principles of connectivity, say in neurons in the brain, you see in galaxies, and you see in ecosystems and all around us, and so many things like fractality is one example of scalability, etc. So you see that, and then what I was discovering is in traditional Chinese thought, as it led to the deeper and deeper understanding of this kind of sense of connectivity, that web of life, around about 1,000 years ago, during the Neo-Confucian era, it was known as the Sung Dynasty, there was this amazing synthesis of three great traditions of thought. There was Taoism, which was very much focused on understanding the Tao as this kind of mysterious way in which nature manifested in the world. You had Buddhism, which had become very prevalent in China, which focused a lot on that recognition of the interdependence of all reality. And then you had, and also focusing on the practice of using meditation as a way of getting in touch with that. And then you had Confucianism, this traditional Chinese way of looking at humans as being deeply embedded in society and in the world in that respect. But they fused all of these three things. The irony is they thought they were rejecting Taoism and Buddhism and trying to have a renaissance of Confucianism. But because those traditions were so deep in the culture at that time, they ended up synthesizing these ideas in what I think is a fascinating synthesis, which comes back to what you're describing. Because they saw the whole cosmos as being composed of essentially chi, which you can just translate in modern English as basically matter and or energy. So stuff. And we know that, from Einstein, you can define matter in terms of energy. It's not, that's indistinguishable in this way. So you have chi, and then you have li, which can be best translated as the principles of organization, the principles according to which all those elements of chi relate to each other. So depending on how they relate, they can either be atoms like this table, they can be organisms like us, or they can be water, or they can be air, all the different stuff of the universe. And it's the li that really determines how that chi manifests.
Tell me if this is a decent interpretation or a decent... when I was looking into the idea of li, or first came across it, it was a fairly simple definition, and you know far more about the history of its evolution, so I'd love to hear you maybe talk about it a bit, but also for the listeners who don't necessarily have a visual, it's described as, I guess, the pattern you would see, the pattern of regularity in like a jade stone, this idea of li, this natural structure that you can tell there's a structure there, but it's not like a rational or crystalline structure, regular structure. There's like semi-regularity, like an ordering principle, but it's not obvious.
Exactly, yeah. Those were the very earliest references to this notion of li, or that also was described as like the ways in which sort of fields were cultivated or whatever. So these kind of patterns of cultivation or whatever like that. So yeah, that's the original, where that sort of word originally came from.
When you say cultivation, human cultivation of the land?
Yeah.
Actually, so they were already drawing those parallels between like deep natural structures and human behavior.
Exactly. So it's kind of interesting to see that. But I think the way in which I like to sort of explain the way in which I sort of understand how the Neo-Confucians saw li is just to think of something simple like, say, a candle flame. And, when we look at a candle flame, we know that the chi, if you will, the stuff it's comprised of is things like there's the wax that's burning, there's the wick, there's the oxygen that's causing this kind of nonsense, and then there's molecules that get very heated, and that forms the flame. So that's the chi, that's the stuff. But we also see that flame is relatively stable over time. You can look at it a few seconds later, you see the same flame. But the molecules in that flame are all different
Right.
than they were before. So what is it that makes the flame the same as it was a few seconds earlier? It's the Li. It's the principles. There's a relatively stable set of interactions between the stuff that makes that stable. And what's so amazing is that we can recognize that's true of ourselves. Like, imagine a photograph of yourself when you were a little child. And you can look at that picture and you know that that's you. You know, there's no question about it. But when you realize that most of the cells in that little kid are no longer around, and even there are some cells that stay in us all of our lives, they're continually changing. So you can know for a virtual fact there is not a single molecule in that little child that's in you now. So what connects you with that kid? And the answer is it's the Li, the principles of organization that were forming that organism when you were a little kid, remain stable even while the Qi, the stuff that you're made of, is changing and changing. And so in a way, that's where you can see that the Li, those principles of organization, in many ways are more important than the actual stuff itself that they're organizing. They're the things that actually give the coherence to reality. And you see that in ecosystems, you see that all around. And that's one of what I see so exciting is that systems thinking in general, in the different ways it's manifested in modern scientific thought, recognizes a lot of that. When we look at principles of how complex systems self-organize. And the fact that these sages from 1,000 years ago were developing these same insights. I mean, one, that's kind of cool just to see that.
Totally.
But more importantly is to realize that they were using these insights to offer wisdom, a recognition of how to get in touch with deep spiritual meaning coming from these traditions. And it allows us to recognize this possibility that from a scientific perspective, if we're looking at the same underlying reality, that means that maybe there is no essential distinction between a scientific and a quote-unquote spiritual interpretation of life. No distinction between the underlying insights of modern science and what we hear from traditional wisdom. So a lot of these splits that we are led by our modern mainstream reality to tell us are there in life may not be there after all.
Yeah, reading your book, it's like the snake is eating its tail. It's coming full circle. That the initial ideas that were seeded from these ancient sacred texts that have been, passed down throughout the ages, now modern science is coming to the same conclusions.
There's actually, along those lines, there's something quite interesting that some of your ideas reminded me of with respect to someone else we've talked about, with Wei saying of the fractal brain theory. I've been reading his book as well, and he describes, you talk a lot about pattern, the patterning instinct, and he also talks a lot about like underlying symmetries and these ideas of all living systems as diversifying by breaking symmetries and creating all different types of forms that might move down their own path in the world, but then recreating higher levels of symmetry by recohering all those parts that previously broke their symmetries. And so I think kind of what we're talking about in a way is that East and West kind of fragmented and broke an initial more holistic symmetry. And now we're starting to see again the synthesis by way of realizing that there are limitations to each of these modes of being or cultures in isolation. So we're kind of reunifying, like we're kind of acting out this meta game that's just a reflection of these same principles.
Yeah, I see where you're going on that, and that's interesting. And at the same time, of course, we don't know really where we're going, because if we look at our modern currents, we're excited by, and so many others around are excited by recognizing these possibilities. And we also see the power of this kind of mainstream worldview that is basically just going full frontal, destroying so much of the natural world and telling billions of people around the world that that's not the reality. That the reality is consumption and material wealth is what it's about. And so I do see one of the most important things we can be looking at in today's world is these different currents, and there's this really open question as to what are the ones that will be really determining the future of humanity. Because in a way, one will become predominant, and that's why I think this century is so crucial for the long-term future of humanity, because we're kind of entering a tipping point, but it's not clear which direction we're going in. And if what you're describing does turn out to be the dominant direction, that could lead to real hope for human flourishing on this world, if we can begin to build a worldview recognizing some of this ancient wisdom, connecting with modern scientific interpretation and a place of harmony. And at the same time, I think we have to be so aware that these other forces, really forces of destruction, are so powerful in our world at the same today.
Yeah. The destructive nature of that. So there's something that you speak about in terms of the notion of framing natural resources as resources, as opposed to actually, I guess, as you put it, realizing the intrinsic value of nature or natural systems, or perhaps the intrinsic value of Li. It reminds me of an event we were at recently at the Long Now on storytelling and climate change. And a lot of that was also very data focused, very focused on the frames of perhaps resources, as opposed to the intrinsic value of nature and this idea of a coherent Li system. But if you were telling that story, or if you were reframing that story to convince people or have people connect with this idea of intrinsic value of nature, how would you do that? Or where do you see, where are good leads to follow from the research that you've done in bringing that to the forefront of our consciousness? Yeah,
these are such profound questions. And and I think, just for starters, talking about stories, I mean, one of the stories basically come in a way from these founding metaphors of making sense of the world that I kind of look at in the book. And in fact, the book itself is structured according to these core metaphors in which different civilizations in history have made sense of the world. And so, looking at our modern world, one of these core metaphors is this notion of nature as a machine, or nature basically as this kind of lifeless resource, as another way of looking at it, from those dualistic splits that we were looking at earlier. So a lot of the time, what we see in today's world is that because where the power resides is in the big corporate structures, or this notion of using nature as a resource in order to get the raw materials to give more consumption for humanity. Even a lot of environmentalists who are really focused on trying to save nature from this kind of destructive behavior, they sort of get into this mode of, well, we need to relate to these corporate powers. So they've come up with this kind of new metaphor, for example, of nature as ecosystem services. And this sort of light bulb goes off, and a lot of people in ecological and environmental sciences say, well, if we can only point out that these marshlands or this coral reef has this tremendous amount of value, then we can get these people making these big corporate or government decisions to, decide to maintain them rather than destroy them. Which is very well-meaning, but the danger to
put a number on it
is that exactly, you basically create these core metaphor that everything can become part of this kind of market reality, that the world itself is nothing other than this gigantic market, and you can just decide what's more valuable than not. So then if you say this coral reef is worth $100 million, and then somebody else can come along and say, yeah, but I can build this resort in this area it's got a value of $200 million, so screw the coral reef, let's just get going. And that's the problem. Or when you look at climate change and the fact that the Arctic is going to melt in our generation, then you get all these oil companies going, well, that's great, because now we can mine for the oil up there that we couldn't have reached before. So there's a real danger to that. And so I do feel you have to get back to this notion of a different way of valuing nature. And the way to really look at that notion of intrinsic value is to recognize that we ourselves are nature. I mean, it's not like this is core mistake of us being separate from nature. We are nature. The only ways in which we as human beings can thrive and flourish is by being on a world that is flourishing, by being because we are interconnected. The very air we breathe, the food that we eat, everything around us, the sense of meaning we get arises from our place in the natural world. Anyone who's ever been for a walk in nature knows that feeling you get when you start to look around you and feel what you're connected with. And it's not just sort of then nature as this kind of aesthetic environment that's there for us, but it's the recognition that nature exists inside us. The microbes that exist within us are part of nature. And we can't have any kind of meaningful existence without recognizing that we're part of that interconnected web, of what I call web of meaning. And so that's a different way of looking at really how to make sense of all of the stuff. So when we look at protecting nature or protecting natural ecosystems from destruction, we begin to realize that it's not a matter of how much can they be valued at in some marketplace, but their intrinsic worth. And in fact, that as soon as we try to apply a dollar cost on those things, we get away from that core recognition.
Yeah. When I think about how we can start to change the future, we have to start with ourselves, of course. And like you said, we are nature. And so a lot of these philosophies, what's so beautiful about them for me is that Taoism, for me personally, I see the world Taoistically. Like I just see it, how these yin and yang, these polarities exist, this explicit duality within an implicit unity. But then within myself, I see this as well. And so I feel like I am nature as I understand nature. And so it's like this as above, so below, as within, so without type of model that enables us. It's where Buddhism and these other contemplative practices become important, because we can actually transform our inner experience. Our spiritual journey begins every breath we take. And so when I think about the world that, it's so chaotic, there's so many things, there's such inertia headed down the wrong path. Well, there's also this Zen notion of you can wake up like that. And we can do that all together. And so these philosophies enable us to experience that in our own felt presence. And if we can all experience that ourselves and then share that experience with each other, it enables a new collective body that when we can tap into and we can feel there's this web of meaning, there's this abundant sense of connection, of oneness, that's so beautiful, so transformational, that no materialist consumptive type of thing you might be reaching for can compare it to.
Yes, I think that's so true. And that's what you're describing is what gives me reason to feel hope, even in this really kind of dark time we're in right now, and even looking at some of these forces of destruction we see all around us. And to me, a lot of that hope comes from looking at what you're describing, this possibility for each of us to wake up, and also recognizing that in just about virtually every human being in the world today, there is this core sense of this connectedness, this desire to connect, this desire to feel at home with community, at home with others, at home in the natural world. And, we're told from the sort of mainstream media and modern reductionist scientists that basically humans are individualistic, they're selfish, that they're separate from each other, we're separate even from ourselves, mind and body, and humans are separate from nature, all these senses of separations. And in fact, this is just all part of the modern myth that arose with the scientific revolution. And in fact, what I found so fascinating, when cognitive scientists and evolutionary biologists look at what makes humans really unique among other primates, for example, is that we evolved to be with each other in community. We evolved to actually recognize our connectedness with what was around us. And that's why there's a strong drive in every human being for empathy, for compassion, for a sense of brotherhood and sisterhood, a sense of family, a sense of kinship. But we're sort of hypnotized from media from the very youngest years as we grow up to be told that's not what we're really about, that we're really about these other places of consuming and being separate and status, etc. But the reason that gives us hope is that it's there in all of us. And I think that we see nowadays, as our world gets to be more and more imbalanced, and these crazy inequalities and this rampaging destruction of nature is taking place, more and more people are waking up to that. And some will wake up through a path like Zen or a path like meditation. Others can simply wake up through their heartfelt recognition of, I'm just not going to accept this crap. There's something wrong here. I'm going to do something about it. And they realize that others are like that. And that's what gives me real profound hope for the possibilities. There's this environmentalist, Paul Hawken, I mention in the book, who wrote a book called Blessed Unrest some years ago, looking at the number of movements around in the world right now of just small organizations and big organizations, but he was counting probably more than 1 million, even at that time, different organizations of people getting together to essentially fight for life against a society that is one bent on destruction. And he sees that as probably the biggest social movement in all of history. And that's what we're part of. And that's what we're part of right now as we're talking. And so many of us in the different things we're doing are recognizing that and waking up and saying, you know, we can make a difference. And that difference arises from the connectivity. Because as we understand from systems recognition, it's like it's the network, the power of the network is a function of the square of the connections within that network, which means that the more that we're recognizing our connections with other people and what they're doing, and what my theme relating to your theme, how they relate to each other and how they can build on each other, that's what gives the whole movement for life basically power.
Talking a little bit about that, you know, the connection between change, evolution, and the structures that also are kind of inertial, or that keep the previous world revivifying itself continuously, and how we perhaps transform that. I'm interested in a couple things, and maybe this can serve to tie a few of the themes we've talked about together. So we are in a space that's effectively a decentralization or blockchain co-working space, Starship mission here, or Starfish mission, Starship, like Starship Earth. Perhaps it is a starship too. But so something, just to kind of go to the base level of this conversation, a topic that or a concept that you use that really struck me is this idea of humanity crossing the metaphorical threshold. So the idea that we were able to begin operating not just in the reality of action, but also at a level of abstraction using symbols to represent reality. And as soon as you kind of make that split, then you're playing two games in a way. And then there's a relationship between those two games, which is also kind of related to the idea of culture shaping the values, and quite concretely tied to the story. And this is something I've been exploring a lot and writing about, which is like the story of how the tokens of our value came to be, and what the implications of those tokens and like what they represent are. So like our monetary tokens and what they are capable of representing about our values in our society, or our coherence, or our li, or what they're not capable. And I think most of the things I just listed, they're actually not very capable. And so do you think that some of the things that we've just been discussing can be encoded in new forms of value representation to better facilitate value flows through complex systems that are more in service of the reality of both survival and coherence? Or do you think that this is something that as soon as you start encoding it into some monetary system, you're already on the wrong path? Like where's your insight there?
I think I understand where you're coming from. And, you know, I think that one question that I've pondered a lot is, you know, is there really some sense of intrinsic value that can be recognized from our symbolic thought process? So I think it's kind of another way of looking at what you're saying. And as I look at where intrinsic value comes from. If we think in terms of Li, this notion of connectivity, or we think in terms of modern systems thinking, that it's not just, there's value not just in connection itself, but it's the form in which things connect, this complex integrated form in which things connect. So for, like, I'll give you some examples. Like, imagine at one extreme, you can have complete non-connection. Like, imagine sort of just smoke particles and they're Brownian motion, that they're just kind of randomly moving around.
The chaos.
Kind of each unconnected with each other.
Yeah.
But then imagine another extreme of, say, ice in crystalline form, where you could say they're strongly connected. Everything, you know, there's this really, really tight connection, but it's a very simple kind of connection. It's crystalline. There's nothing, it doesn't sort of move much. And then there's something in between. And if you think of this kind of place where that sort of crystalline softens, and a place where the kind of smoke particles begin to form in sort of more meaning, there's that place in between that a complexity scientist, Stuart Kaufman, really looks at. That's where we can see the emergence of life.
The edge of chaos.
The edge of chaos, exactly. And in fact, if you look at, say, how the brain works, people who have looked at the networks of the brain, it's between those two. It's not like it's completely, everything is connected in this fragmented way, and it's not really fixed, but it's this notion of a complex, integrated, coherent set of connections. And I think the word integration is key in recognizing this. They're connected in a way where it's more and more integrated. And in fact, there are some neuroscientists who think that the way to understand consciousness is a measure that they call phi, which is really this measure of integrated connectedness.
Christoph Koch.
Exactly, you got it, totally. Actually, Tononi, Julia Tononi is the one
Wisconsin.
Who was, exactly.
And Francis Crick was working with them as well.
Yeah, he did originally, exactly. But I think it's Tononi who is the one who's come up with this notion of phi.
Yeah.
So the reason, it's kind of a long way to come back to your question, because then as I look at complexity itself, if we look at why is life valuable? Why do we feel that there's value in life? Well, I think ultimately it's because of the complex way in which it interacts with each other. So if we just think of, and you know, we actually see that even in aesthetics, when people look at different landscapes. You can have a landscape that's really, really busy and like filled with forest. You can have a landscape that's desert. You can have more like a savanna kind of landscape. And people move towards the savanna landscape, this notion of biophilia or whatever, because there's a certain level of fractality, basically, of complexity in a certain vision that feels right to us. And I think that relates to a lot to what is the fundamental, I want to say essence, but it's more like the fundamental dynamics that lead to life. And I think if we take that as a notion of value, we can almost recognize, we can come up with some sense of what I almost think of as you could think of it like a Lie quotient, or the complexity or integrative quotient of is there if that number is higher, if that quotient is higher, then there's more intrinsic value in something. If it's lower, there's less intrinsic value. So if you look at an ecosystem and somebody says, well, I can mine the resources out of that ecosystem, it'll destroy the life. So you gain from some amount of those resources you gain, and what you lose is this complexity of that ecosystem. Yeah. So when you're measuring intrinsic value from that kind of sense, it's pretty clear that you're losing more than you're gaining. It's
like a conservation. I think what you're getting at, or what I'm hearing, is like a conservation of like a dynamic potential, or like maintaining the system's potential to constantly transform and sustain itself and generate new forms of adaptive life or patterns.
Exactly. And I think what's so important about that is that it looks at the potential role for technology in a thriving future. Because a lot of the time, I mean, the way we see technology manifested a lot in today's world is in this form of kind of, it's almost like a complexity reducing technology, even though it looks incredibly, it looks incredibly complicated. But complicated is different from complex. So we have technology. A lot of technology works to essentially create more separations. separations between humans, or separating humans from nature, or all the different ways in which technology works today. Or it works by sort of breaking things down into bits and then sort of reconstituting them. But we can imagine technology also working in ways that can lead further to integration. So even things like AI can be developed in ways that lead to a separation between things and a reduction in that core intrinsic value, or potentially could work to enhance the intrinsic value of life.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important, when we look at there's sort of some groups of environmentalist-oriented people who just see technology as intrinsically bad, with good reason, because it's done so much damage over centuries. But it's also possible to see technology as, in fact, that's really the greatest challenge for those developing at the cutting edges of technology. How can we actually think about technology in a way that increases that complexity, that enhances life, rather than works against life?
That's so key, because, in complexity science, one of the key themes is these attractor states that systems are driving themselves towards.
Exactly.
And right now, the attractor states that we operate under are primarily like GDP. Is something that we use that, as Robert Kennedy mentioned, measures everything but that which makes life worthwhile.
Right.
And you have a country like Bhutan that now has the gross national happiness index that helps them make their decisions. But this idea of a quantifiably or some way to gauge the level of patterning within the ecosystems of life. And so it brings me back to, which is also mentioned in your book, the Gaia principle that James Lovelock and Lynn Margolis put forward in like the late 60s, that has continued to see this is what it is. It's like this is this planet that is ecosystems on top of ecosystems, everything interconnected. And for us trying to wrestle with the 21st century, the future of our world, it seems like having some way to measure our activity in this planet with respect to this web of life, these reverberations across ecosystems, is so essential. I wonder that's a project that we need to collectively come together and do. That seems to me could help catalyze a new paradigm of sorts.
Yes, I so agree with this. In fact, this is I'm kind of smiling because it's something I've been talking with people about and thinking about a lot myself. Is this, a lot of the time as humans in society, we get what we measure. So if you measure, if you're in a company and you say, we're going to increase revenues, I'm going to measure people on revenues go up. They say, we're going to focus on profits rather than revenues. Suddenly profits go up because people start acting in different ways. So as countries, we are obsessed by this notion of GDP, which, just as you say, measures nothing other than the rate at which we're monetizing the natural world and human activity and bringing it into the financial economy. That's all it measures. So we get that, and that's what we're doing. So the thing is, how can we come up with a measurement that on a quarterly basis we can be looking at and saying, GDP went up in this country, but this other measurement actually went down. Or conversely, GDP might have gone down in this country, but their actual happiness index or whatever went up. And to that point, there's this fabulous book written by somebody called Kate Raworth, an English economist, called Donut Economics, which does a great job of offering a different kind of platform for thinking about these things. And what she describes, the reason it's called a donut is that imagine a shape of a donut, and the inner part of the donut represents the bare minimum that's required for humans to live a normal and flourishing life. So deals with things like sort of access to food, home, security, and those basic things, which obviously billions of people in today's world are below that level. And then the outer part of that donut looks at the ways in which we can live within the sustainability of our biosphere. And you may be familiar with a paper that's come out the last few years that looks at different dimensions of whether we're living within the sort of guardrails of society. And there's out of about 7 either 7 or 9 dimensions. Like there's 3 or 4 that we're totally out of those bounds. But so you can fit this into like a measurement routine and saying, really, what to optimize our chances for human flourishing, we need to, on the outside of the donut, we need to bring ourselves in, and within the inner part of the donut, we need to expand so people, all people everywhere, can lead, have the basics for a flourishing life, and that's what it's about. And you can actually measure those things, and so
which is a coherent state.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
So I've been kind of exploring with 1 or 2 people what can be done to actually look at that kind of measurement.
Yeah, amazing. I have 2. Like I call it the global indicators of well-being. That I've been like, this to me is such an important thing that we need to do. So yeah, it's great to hear that you've been working on that too. This is like a collective thing that we need to agree upon.
Yeah. We're gonna catalyze more voices. Perhaps
initiate some projects
together. Exactly.
Yeah,
and,
for sure.
Yeah, and in fact, there's somebody called Mathis Wackernagle. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name right, but he's actually just been putting out recently a fabulous website that looks at like focusing on those outer bounds,
right?
Where each country is, and on an ongoing measurement of where we stand in relation to those sort of sustainability functions.
Yeah, and it will be an emergent coherence, right?
Yes.
So like a lot of these things like if we were to try to top-down structure this, it wouldn't work.
It has to be. We got to get buy-in.
It requires this bottom-up community to say like emerge through, or to have the order emerge through chaos.
Definitely. Well, also speaking of order and chaos, and you play in the space of culture and the stories that shape our values and the evolution of like religion and philosophy and meaning. And so, there's another person in the zeitgeist who plays in that space who's very popular right now, who's kind of touched on some of our work, but his name's Jordan Peterson. I don't know if you've heard of him or seen his work. I'm curious in terms of, there's a lot of overlap in the topics that you cover. I'm sure you also perceive differences between your perspective and his perspective. I'd be really interested to hear what your take is on his work and how he's addressing these topics, and where you may agree and where you may disagree with kind of his program, so to speak.
Yes. Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm certainly not an expert on his work. I haven't read any of his books. So I know more than anything about how he's perceived right now in popular culture.
Sure.
And my basic understanding is that he represents a very dangerous trend in the ways of relating to meaning and relating to kind of values in our culture right now. So it seems that he speaks primarily to a particular group of people within our society who are feeling that they have been sort of left out of where society is moving. And particularly it seems to speak to white males in our society who feel that they're getting left out of this kind of evolution of sort of social complexity or whatever. And my own sense is that he is offering solutions that are more about separation, that they actually exacerbate the kind of tribalism that is such a dangerous prevalence in our society today. And I get very uncomfortable with some of the values that he's putting out there, and some of the ways in which really a subgroup of people who have been the most powerful group within modern history, essentially, the sort of the white Anglo-Saxon male, if you will, who were beginning to feel some of that empowerment slipping as other parts of humanity get to get heard more and get to have more of their place, feeling aggrieved and wanting to grab back some of the power that they have been enjoying for so many centuries. And my approach is the opposite of that. My sense is that we actually, and I'm a white Anglo-Saxon male, and so you both, I'm assuming, and so we are in that place of relative social and political power, and I think the greatest way for us to actually be more empowered and to be able to flourish the most in the world is to embrace the diversity and to bring up those ethnic groups who have been disempowered in the past, and to actually to share that place of power with other groups around us, is to actually make the whole space bigger, so that there's no zero-sum game. We're not losing anything by bringing up other ethnic groups. We're actually all gaining, and that's from this recognition of the interconnectedness of things. And as soon as we begin to see things in terms of a zero-sum game, we all lose. As soon as we get to recognize the empowerment of others is the empowerment of ourselves, we have the opportunity for a much more flourishing world.
Yeah, I think I definitely, I very much agree with your sentiment and your characterization of the way the world should kind of evolve in terms of us being able to incorporate all of what everyone has to offer, and therefore create a better world for everyone who's trying to fulfill their potential in this world. I think it is interesting. One of the reasons I asked that is I've also noticed that. So I came across his work before he was kind of thrust into the public limelight, and the earlier stuff, especially Maps of Meaning and his lectures, I think, I don't know, I'd be interested to hear what you thought of them if you were exposed to the work, as opposed to kind of the metagame that's emerged around him. Because there's a lot of heat, there's a lot of friction, and there is definitely that narrative and that story in the culture right now about him appealing specifically to this demographic of disenfranchised white males. That said, I mean, I know he doesn't see himself that way, and he tries not to be that. He's like more individualistic in his the idea of creating strong individuals that can emerge into more coherent collectives, whatever the group identities might be, but dips deeply into the mythopoetic domain to try to paint the landscape. That being said, the way he does so is far more informed, while it's informed by East and West, I think is far more informed by West. And he does see, in many ways, has said that the kind of Christian paradigm is in a way like the apotheosis of this embodiment or incarnation of the kind of evolution of spirituality as a landscape of meaning. And I think that's probably where you guys would differ mostly in terms of perhaps you perceiving far more deep wisdom and refinement in the Neo-Confucian perspective that that is a far less hierarchical structure, so to speak.
Well, yes, but also to clarify, again, just like we were touching on earlier in the conversation, I want to make sure that we don't get caught up in sort of golden ageism of the Neo-Confucian perspective. That was a hugely hierarchical society that these ideas came from. And I think my primary interest is in looking forward and looking at what kind of wisdom can we gain from these insights from other cultures, recognizing, one of the dangers is that there are so many sort of worldviews, and whether it's Jordan Peterson looking at the apotheosis in Western sort of Christianity or whatever, or even you see that in integral theory with where Wilber puts these great these like complex ideas together. But in so many ways, you often get white males who look at all of history as essentially culminating in the greatest wisdom of their own interpretation of the world, And I think we have to be really, really careful and watch out for that. And again, I speak as a white male, recognizing that. Yeah. But I think we have to recognize that the real development is to actually integrate with these different strands of meaning all around us, and the ways in which we can celebrate differences, celebrate diverse ways of even finding meaning as part of an overall sort of meta meaning. That I think allows us to move forward with the best wisdom. Yeah,
it seems so important to be able to have the conversation at a granular level, right? To be able to look at the history of both our culture and other cultures and say, that's given us a lot, but it also has a lot of downsides that are potentially hurting people or destroying the world in this way or that. While they are also providing a high quality of living, how do we look at integrating that with other perspectives so that we can ideally continue improving the quality of living for as many people as possible, everyone ideally, while tamping down the negative sides, the externalities, the destruction of the earth, nature, lack of access to opportunity for much of the world's population, the lack of ability for many people to fulfill their potential. I mean, I guess like when people ask me like what my vision is for the world, it's like a world in which everyone has the opportunity to fulfill their potential, right? Or to pursue the fulfillment of their potential.
Yes, exactly.
In a coherent manner.
Exactly. And if I could just sort of add a layer on top of that, it's also recognizing that once we begin to define our personness, our personhood, not just as individuals, but as being part of the emergent community of life with others and the world around us. So to take that first thing you said of everyone having the potential to fulfill, or to having the ability to fulfill their potential to the maximum, and also for their ability as part of their community to fulfill their community's potential to the maximum, and as part of flourishing on the natural world to fulfill the whole natural Gaia system, as you were referring to it. So realizing that our very identity is fractal. And that, I think, is one of the key transformative ways in which we can move forward.
Totally.
Start with like building the strong self, and then building the strong community, and then building the strong society, and then, or not strong is probably the right word. Balance might be a better word.
Or flourishing,
coherent, flourishing, vibrant,
and the recognition that it's not even building first within ourselves, but it's this notion of reciprocal causality that this great philosopher Evan Thompson talks about.
The co-creation.
Is that while we're working on creating a flourishing world, and creating a flourishing community, and creating a flourishing being within ourselves, those things work with each other. So to focus our work on just one of those at the expense of the other two is to lead. Is to lead to an imbalance at some place. And of course, at some times in our life, we might feel a particular need to be in community or need to work on something in ourselves. And that's great to listen to that, but as only it really at some point we'll recognize then, if we're truly growing, that those things are interconnected. And you can't, somebody who's truly spiritually awakened in this world today, but who ignores the destruction that's going on in our world around us and the suffering other humans are experiencing right now, is not truly spiritually awakened. You can't be truly awakened without that recognition of what's going on around and each of our parts in that. That the very luxury we have to sit here today and use technology to talk together has only arisen out of these imbalances that are causing billions of people in the world right now to be living on $1 or $2 a day and suffering hugely and barely able to eat enough to even maintain life. And recognizing that part of that interconnected web of life is to recognize those things and not to then fall into a sort of whirlpool of guilt and feel paralyzed, but to recognize that means that having that luxury that we have also gives us a responsibility to try to make the world a place that offers more to everyone around us.
Right. And in your book, and we're sort of running up on time here, so we'll try to wind down, but you close with looking into the future. We tell this whole story of humanity and how we've gotten to now and what this now is in the context of like where we think we're going. And there's this idea of the technological singularity that some folks around these towns that we inhabit here in San Francisco and the Bay Area talk about, and all around the world, people are there's transhumanists. There's people that, not incorrectly perceive our relationship with technology as this sort of cyborg relationship. I would argue that we've always been like that, from the very invention of language itself to the tools that helped us hunt. We've always been using technologies. But there is this grandiose vision of like, where are we going and what could be coming? Can you speak to that at all? What are your thoughts on where we are, where we're going? I know that's a very large question, but we're talking about the biggest questions that are.
Tell us the future.
And well, as you say, that final chapter of the book is called "Trajectories to Our Future," and I think, yeah, the first thing to recognize is that wherever we're going is not predetermined. We can't actually predict where we're going, but we can look at certain possible trajectories which move in very different directions. So there is this one notion of continued technological growth. And that's, I find interesting, and I'd like to come back to that, if you will. But let's sort of, viewing that as one notion of some sort of singularity type approach that we're headed to. There's also this, at the other extreme, there's this possibility of collapse, of this recognition that actually the ways in which we're consuming the earth at far too rapid a rate, totally unsustainably, is, unless something shifts over the next couple of generations, it could lead to our civilization is built on a ton of very complex networks that don't have much redundancy built into them.
Just to interject real quickly, so as I mentioned, I was at Singularity University in 2012. They're talking about a singularity, but then at the Santa Fe Institute, one of my favorite researchers there, Jeffrey West, he talks about singularity as well, but his singularity is environmental collapse.
Yes, I'm so glad you're reading Jeffrey West. His book Scale is one of the most profound, brilliant books
I
written
did some
in
work
recent
at the Santa
years.
Fe Institute. We're a big fan of the work they're doing.
Yeah,
Scale is another
wonderful.
critical read to get a grasp of the world.
And the concept between both of those singularities as well is this notion of acceleration towards a point that is kind of unknowable, but also unavoidable in some context. But it's like, what is that point? What are we accelerating towards, and in which direction are we accelerating?
Exactly.
Which circles back to your idea of trajectories.
Yeah. So, and I think that's right. And like Jeffrey West in his final chapter of his book just does such a great description of, from a physics point of view, just recognizing the unsustainability of where we're headed. And it's brilliant. But one of the things I think people don't talk about as much as we should is this notion of what I call techno-split. And it's this, you can sort of get this idea, but when you look at this unsustainable path we're on, and you look at people in power, both financial power and political power around the world, not doing anything about it, and you ask why, I think one of the reasons why is because what a lot of these people say to themselves, either consciously or just kind of unconsciously, is, well, it's not going to happen to us. It'll happen if things collapse. We'll almost like this notion of a fortress Earth future.
Like every other large-scale civilization has collapsed eventually, but it won't happen to us.
But their way of thinking, well, maybe billions of people will sort of fall into this kind of climate change and everything else disasters. But as long as we can, there's some validity to this. If you look, for example, at, say, Central Africa, which has been essentially in a state of collapse for decades, where you have childhood slavery, mass rapes, continual warfare, just utter devastation. And yet, because of that very notion, because of the desperation, there are people working as slaves, mining the rare earths or the diamonds or gold that becomes part of our modern technological civilization. So, that's part of what I mean by techno-split. I think there's this scenario where, for the affluent few in the world, civilization continues and we explore new ways of being human through cyborg possibilities and a greater degree of interconnectedness, even genetic enhancement, everything else. And meanwhile, billions of people really become the underclass dealing with the real collapse of humanity for themselves. And I think the reason I feel that's important is I think that a lot of people kind of feel that's where things are going, but when they're in the affluent world able to do something about it, they don't feel quite as urgent a need because they sort of figure they and their kids will be one of the ones that'll be okay. And that's a massive moral responsibility. Like if you buy into this definition of humanity as and this sense of universal human rights, and as a brotherhood and sisterhood of shared, and just like you were describing before, that every human being should have this potential for really, or have the ability to really pursue that potential, then that is an absolute disgrace that we're moving in that direction. But I think that's something for us to be aware of, because unless we do something about it, we may be moving in that direction, is the point. And that direction, if we can, is there a way to pursue an advanced technological society that is available for all human beings? And I believe the answer is yes, but only by really trying to reorient technology to working for humanity as a whole, and working for the natural systems as a whole, not working instead of. So, you know, when we look at the death of the mass death of pollinators through the pollution that we're putting out there, and then technological solutions come up with, well, let's just make these micro drones that can just pollinate. I mean, that's a way in which technology is being used for the destruction of the planet, but maintaining this kind of techno-split scenario. The question, can we use technology in ways that allow us to repopulate the earth with life?
Right.
And I think the answer is yes, but that's a more of a challenge.
Yeah, in service to life, in service of creating more life, in service creating higher quality life for as many different types of life that might exist now or in the future.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that the question to ask when we're looking at, you know, any new technology, how are we looking at it, is this question, is it serving life? Coming back to some of these questions we were looking at earlier, what is a measurement of true value? And so is it allowing for greater integration, greater complexity of the natural systems that we're part of, or is it reducing that level of complexity? I think those are the questions we should be asking.
Yeah, I think, and a lot of the answers, at least I think all of us in this room probably believe that many of them lie within this intersection of understanding our own nature, our own, I guess what we call biology, this kind of physical inertia that we have, that there's almost like a thrownness to it where we can't escape it, we have to deal with it. And then also these other layers we built on top of it, our culture, our stories, our value systems, the way we represent it, the way we communicate it, the way we transact it, and how. So I guess in your mind, I'm curious to hear. I guess we should probably wrap up here pretty soon, but this notion of the biological versus the cultural, or the biological and the cultural, the relationship between the two, that's like obviously a hot topic
and also
right now.
Technology as biology. I mean, Kevin Kelly talks about it as the seventh kingdom of life. People don't see it in that lens, and they ought to see it more in this sort of continuum of life on different scales.
Yeah, and like there's the idea of Derrida, which is like there's nothing outside the text, which is what he's most famous for, right? This idea that, which is kind of the extreme version of there is nothing outside the cultural frame of reference.
Yes.
That being said, like I have a very hard time digesting a statement like that, because once again, it's the I am therefore I think as well, right? Because like there is a biological element. We are a part of the life process, and the life process began before the text.
Right. Yeah, I think this is, in a way, it comes down to this core notion of what makes us as humans different from other natural organisms in the world, and which comes back a lot to some of the notions of Taoism that you were referring to earlier. So I'll sort of explain how I'm sort of weaving these in. That, if you will, what the sort of Taoists, such as in the Tao Te Ching and Chuang-Tzu, who is this brilliant Taoist philosopher, when they look at what Taoism means, it's essentially, or the human role within Taoism, it's essentially the sense that what we want to do is to get back in touch with our sort of true nature, if you will. And our true nature is, in that sense, is being part of the natural world. And they have this concept of wu wei, which is or effortless action, or acting without putting our conscious awareness into things. But then the dilemma comes that when, in fact, the Taoists saw the rise of language as the beginning of the separation from the Tao. And then they saw culture and civilization as separating humans from the Tao, and that's the great loss. So while the Greeks, on the one hand, were celebrating reason as the great thing that makes us divine, the Taoists, at the same time, were looking at the growth of reason and language as what separated us from the Tao. So this is the kind of paradox, if you will, that as humans, it's as though we develop a different layer of consciousness. So if you can think of animate consciousness as being a consciousness that all creatures share, maybe from as small as a single cell organism to any other mammal. It's this consciousness of being connected, of recognizing a certain membrane between us and the world, and having some sense of awareness. And then, as humans, we develop this symbolic consciousness. As you say, we became sort of cyborgs, essentially, with language. When we developed a different way of being of conceiving of the world, which gave us, it was what I call a patterning instinct, which is this uniquely human, not that other animals don't have a patterning instinct, but we have it to a uniquely great degree, which then leads to language, leads to culture, leads to technology, leads to the imbalances we have in the world, so that even hunter-gatherers who saw themselves as being totally part of nature, and nature being like this giving mother and father, they led to some of the greatest extinctions in all of the Earth's history when they went from Africa to the Americas or to Australia, because they had this power of tool creation that gave them this amazing power to create these imbalances with the natural world as it was before them. So as humans, that's where in a way I sort of part company with pure Taoism, because they did have the sense of a golden age before language, before all this stuff. And that's where things like Neo-Confucianism get to be so exciting, and our ability to forge something new as we look forward. To recognize that as humans, there's no going back. We can't sort of undo our conceptual consciousness, and we don't want to. There are so many wonderful things that we gain from this ability to see the world in this conceptual way as well as in this animate way. And that's why I feel the way forward is really a way of integration. It's a way of truly exploring how to integrate that conceptual consciousness, the one that leads to technology, to culture, to essentially that causes us to be somewhat separate from the natural world, and to integrate that with our animate consciousness, that sense that, yes, we as humans, we are nature. Nature is all around us. And it's through exploring that place of integration, I think, that we have the potential for a truly sustainable, flourishing future for humans on the earth.
Thank you so much for that.
Entirely on board with that.
Yeah,
for sure.
I wanted to close with this passage that actually is quite poetically describing integration. Where did you find this, by the way? It's the first time I had come across it.
Oh, you're saying that Western inscription by Chiang Tsai?
Yes, Chiang Tsai.
Well, really, through my research of Neo-Confucian thought, and when I came across it, I mean, what's interesting is we in the West, virtually nobody has ever heard this quote. Yeah. But in traditional Chinese thought, it's an icon. I mean, it's almost as important as Descartes saying, "I think, therefore I am." It's called the Western inscription, and it's one of the great classic statements of Chinese civilization.
Yeah, and so we'll close with this. It is really, it's beautiful. So it goes, "Heaven is my father and earth is my mother, and I, a small child, find myself placed intimately between them. What fills the universe I regard as my body. What directs the universe I regard as my nature. All people are my brothers and sisters. All things are my companions." And so I say yes to that. Yeah. And I say thank you so much for joining us today. For the folks listening, spread the message. We are all connected into this web of life, of meaning that we're creating together, and it's works like this, which I truly believe is a perennial piece of work that you've created here. Go get this book. You'll learn a ton. The Patterning Instinct. Jeremy Lent, thank you so much for joining us today.
And thank you to you both for this great conversation and for the work that you're doing. I think it's so important and great that you're doing it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here with us to catalyze coherence. And
Namaste,
if anyone
friends.
listening wants to help facilitate that, patreon.com/coherence is our place where we're basically putting out the hat. So please help us create more of these and catalyze coherence, and we'll have more conversations with Jeremy and other people like him.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Cheers.
Thank you.